Chapter 16 of Murder in the Gunroom. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Murder in the Gunroom by H. Beam Piper. Chapter 16. It was raining again as Rand parked his car about 100 yards up the street from Karen Lawrence's antique shop. The windows were dark, but Karen was waiting inside the door for him. He entered quickly, mindful of the all-seeing eye across the street, and followed her to a back room where Mrs. Jarrett and Dorothy Gresham were. All three women regarded him intently, as though trying to decide whether he was friend or enemy. There was a long silence before Mrs. Jarrett spoke, and when she did, her words were almost the same as Karen's when she had spoken over the phone. "Colonel Rand," she began, obviously struggling with herself, "you must tell me the truth. Did you have anything to do with my son's being arrested?" Rand shook his head. "Absolutely nothing, Mrs. Jarrett," he told her, unbuckling the belt of his raincoat and taking it off. "I've never seriously suspected your son of the Rivers murder. I had no idea that McKenna was contemplating arresting him, and if I had, I would have advised him against it. Besides causing annoyance to innocent people, McKenna's made a serious tactical error. He was misled by appearances, and he was afraid I'd break this case before he did, which I intended to do." He turned to Karen Lawrence. "I talked to McKenna after you called me. He as much as admitted making that arrest to get in ahead of me." "I told you," Dorothy Gresham flashed at the others. "I knew Jeff wouldn't stoop to anything as contemptible as pretending to be Pierre's friend and then getting him arrested." Rand permitted himself a wry inward smile. He hoped she would not have an opportunity to observe his stooping capabilities before he had finished his various operations at Rosemont. "I certainly hoped not. I certainly hoped not." Mrs. Jarrett relaxed, smiling faintly at Rand. "Pierre likes you, Colonel. I hated the thought that you might have betrayed him. Are you working on the Rivers case, too?" Rand nodded again, turning to Dot Gresham. "Your father retained me to make an investigation," he said. "After that trouble he had with Rivers about that spurious North and Cheney, he wanted the murderer caught before somebody got around to accusing him." "You mean there's a chance Dad might be suspected?" Dot was scared. Rand nodded. The girl was beginning to look suspiciously at Karen and Mrs. Jarrett, getting ready to toss Pierre to the wolves if her father were in danger, Rand suspected. He hastened to reassure her. "Rivers was still alive when your father reached home last evening," he told her. "That's been established." She breathed her obvious relief. If Gresham had left home after Rand's departure with Philip Cabot, she didn't know it. Karen, on the other hand, was growing more and more worried. "Look, Colonel," she began, "they didn't just pull Pierre's name out of a hat. They must have had something to suspect him about." "Yes. You shouldn't have lied to McKenna. He checked up on your story. The woman across the street told him about seeing Pierre leave here a little before 11, and come back about half an hour later." "I was afraid of that," Karen said. "I forgot all about that old hag. There's nothing that can go on around here that she doesn't know about. Pierre calls her Mrs. G, too." "And then," Rand continued, "McKenna claims that a car like Pierre's was seen parked in Rivers Drive about the time Pierre was away from here." Mrs. Jarrett moaned softly. Her face, already haggard, became positively ghastly. Karen gasped in fright. "They only identified it as to model and make. They didn't get the license number." "Where did Pierre go while he was away from here?" "He went out for cigarettes," Karen said. "When he came here from Gresham's, we made some coffee, and then sat and talked for a while, and then we found out that we were both out of cigarettes, and there weren't any here. So Pierre said he'd go out and get some. He was gone about half an hour. When he came back, he had a carton and some hot pork sandwiches. He'd gotten them at the same place as the cigarettes, Art Igo's lunch stand." "Could Igo verify that?" "It wouldn't help if he did. Igo's place isn't a 5-minute drive from Rivers, farther down the road." "Has Pierre a lawyer?" Rand asked. "No, not yet. We were just talking about that." "Dad would defend him," Dot suggested. "Of course, he's not a criminal lawyer." "Carter Tipton in New Belfast," Rand told him. "He's my lawyer. He's gotten me out of more jams than you can shake a stick at. Where's the telephone? I'll call him now." "You think he'd defend Pierre?" "Unless I'm badly mistaken, Pierre isn't going to need any trial defense," Rand told them. "He will need somebody to look after his interests, and we'll try to get him out on a writ as soon as possible." He looked at his watch. It was 10 minutes to 9. It was hard to say where Carter Tipton would be at the moment. His manservant would probably know. Karen showed him the phone, and he started to put through a person-to-person call. It was 11 o'clock before he backed his car into the Fleming garage, and the rain had returned to a wet, sticky snow. All the Flemings' cars were in, but Rand left the garage doors open. He also left his hat and coat in the car. After locating and talking to Tipton and arranging for him to meet Dave Ritter at the Rosemont Inn, he had gone to the State Police substation, where he had talked at length with Mick McKenna. He had been compelled to tell the State Police sergeant a number of things he had intended keeping to himself. When he was through, McKenna went so far as to admit that he had been a trifle hasty in arresting Pierre Jarrett. Rand suspected that he was mentally kicking himself with hobnailed boots for his premature act. He also submitted, for McKenna's approval, the scheme he had outlined to Dave Ritter, and obtained a promise of cooperation. When he entered the Fleming library, en route to the gunroom, he found the entire family assembled there. With them was Humphrey Goode. As he came in, they broke off what had evidently been an acrimonious dispute and gave him their undivided attention. Geraldine, relaxed in a chair, was smoking. For once, she didn't have a glass in her hand. Gladys occupied another chair. She was smoking, too. Nelda had been pacing back and forth like a caged tiger. At Rand's entrance, she turned to face him, and Rand wondered whether she thought he was Clyde Beatty or a side of beef. Goode and Dunmore sat together on the sofa, forming what looked like a bilateral offensive and defensive alliance, and Varcek, looking more than ever like Rudolph Hess, stood with folded arms in one corner. "Now see here, Rand," Dunmore began as soon as the detective was inside the room. "We want to know just exactly for whom you're working around here, and I demand to know where you've been since you left here this evening." "And I," Goode piped up, "must protest most strongly against your involvement in this local murder case. I am informed that, while in the employ of this family, you accepted a retainer from another party to investigate the death of Arnold Rivers." "That's correct," Rand informed him. Then he turned to Gladys. "Just for the record, Mrs. Fleming, do you recall any stipulation to the effect that the business of handling this pistol collection should have the exclusive attention of my agency? I certainly don't recall anything of the sort." "No, of course not," she replied. "As long as the collection is sold to the best advantage, I haven't any interest in any other business of your agency, and have no right to have." She turned to the others. "I thought I made that clear to all of you." "You didn't answer my question," Dunmore yelled at him. "I don't intend to. You aren't my client, and I'm not answerable to you." "Well, you carry my authorization," Goode supported him. "I think I have a right to know what's being done." "As far as the collection's concerned, yes. As for the Rivers murder, or my armored car service, or any other business of the Tri-State Agency, no." "Well, you made use of my authorization to get that revolver from Kirchner," Goode began. "Ah!" Rand cried. "So that concerns the Rivers murder, does it? Well, when did you find that out, now? When Kirchner called you, you had no objection to his giving me that revolver. What changed your mind for you? Didn't you know that Rivers was dead then?" Rand watched Goode trying to assimilate that. "Or didn't you think I knew?" Goode cleared his throat noisily, twisting his mouth. The others were looking back and forth from him to Rand in obvious bewilderment. They realized that Rand had pulled some kind of rabbit out of a hat, but they couldn't understand how he'd done it. "What I mean is that since then, you have allowed yourself to become involved in this murder case. You have let it be publicly known that you are a private detective working for the Fleming family," Goode orated. How long, then, will it be before it will be said by all sorts of irresponsible persons that you are also investigating the death of Lane Fleming?" "Well?" Rand asked patiently. "Are you afraid people will start calling that a murder, too?" Gladys was looking at him apprehensively, as though she were watching him juggle 4 live hand grenades. "Is anybody saying that now?" Varcek asked sharply. "Not that I know of," Rand lied. "But if Goode keeps on denying it, they will." "You know perfectly well," Goode exploded, "that I am alluding to these unfounded and mischievous rumors of suicide, which are doing the Premix Company so much harm." "My God, Mr. Rand, can't you realize—" "Oh, come off it, Goode," Varcek broke in amusedly. "We all, Colonel Rand included, know that you started those rumors yourself. Very clever to start a rumor by denying it, but scarcely original. Dr. Goebbels was doing it almost 20 years ago." "My God, is that true?" Nelda demanded. "You mean he's been going around starting all these stories about Father committing suicide?" She turned on Goode like an enraged panther. "Why, you lying old son of a bitch!" she screamed at him. "Of course. He wants to start a selling run on Premix," Varcek explained to her. "He's buying every share he can get his hands on. We all are." He turned to Rand. "I'd advise you to buy some if you can find any, Colonel Rand. In a month or so, it's going to be a really good thing." "I know about the merger. I am buying," Rand told him. "But are you sure of what Goode's been doing?" "Of course," Gladys put in contemptuously. "I always wondered about this suicide talk. I couldn't see why Humphrey was so perturbed about it. Anything that lowered the market price of Premix, at this time, would be to his advantage." She looked at Goode as though he had 6 legs and a hard shell. "You know, Humphrey, I can't say I exactly thank you for this." "Did you know about it?" Nelda demanded of her husband. "You did! My God, Fred, you are a filthy specimen!" "Oh, you know, anything to turn a dishonest dollar," Geraldine piped up. "Like the late Arnold Rivers' $10,000 offer. Say, I wonder if that mightn't be what Rivers died of, raising the price and leaving Fred out in the cold." Dunmore simply stared at her, making a noise like a chicken choking on a piece of string. "Well, all this isn't my pigeon," Rand said to Gladys. "I only work here. Deo gratis, and I still have some work to do." With that, he walked past Goode and Dunmore and ascended the spiral stairway to the gunroom. Even at the desk in the far corner of the room, he could hear them going at it, hammer and tongs, in the library. Sometimes it would be Nelda's strident shrieks that would dominate the bedlam below. Sometimes it would be Fred Dunmore roaring like a bull. Now and then, Humphrey Goode would rumble something, and once in a while he could hear Gladys's trained and modulated voice. Usually, any remark she made would be followed by outraged shouts from Goode and Dunmore, like the crash of falling masonry after the whip crack of a tank gun. At first, Rand eavesdropped shamelessly, but there was nothing of more than comic interest. It was just a routine parade and guard mount of the older and more dependable family skeletons, with special emphasis on Humphrey Goode's business and professional ethics. When he was satisfied that he would hear nothing having any bearing on the death of Lane Fleming, Rand went back to his work. After a while, the tumult gradually died out. Rand was still typing when Gladys came up the spiral and perched on the corner of the desk, picking up a long brass-barreled English flintlock and hefting it. "You know, I sometimes wonder why we don't all come up here, break out the ammunition, pick our weapons, and settle things," she said. "It never was like this when Lane was around. Oh, Nelda and Geraldine would bare their teeth at each other once in a while, but now this place has turned into a miniature Iwo Jima. I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to take it. I'm developing combat fatigue." "It's snowing," Rand mentioned. "Let's throw them out into the storm." "I can't. I have to give Nelda and Geraldine a home as long as they live," she replied. "Terms of the will. Oh well, Geraldine'll drink herself to death in a few years, and Nelda will elope with a prizefighter sometime." "Why don't you have the house haunted?" "The Tri-State Agency has an excellent house-haunting department. Anything you want. Poltergeist, apparitions, cold, clammy hands in the dark, footsteps in the attic, clanking chains and eldritch screams, banshees. Any three for the price of two." "It wouldn't work. Geraldine is so used to polka-dotted dinosaurs and little green men from Mars that she wouldn't mind an ordinary ghost. And Nelda'd probably try to drag it into bed with her." She laid down the pistol and slid off the desk. "Well, pleasant dreams. I'll see you in the morning." After she had left the gunroom, Rand looked at his watch. It was a very precise instrument, a Swiss military watch with a sweep second hand and 2 timing dials. It had formerly been the property of an Obergruppenführer of the SS, and Rand had appropriated it to replace his own, broken while choking the Obergruppenführer to death in an alley in Palermo. He zeroed the timing dials and pressed the start button. Then he stood for a time over the old cobbler's bench, mentally reconstructing what had been done after Lane Fleming had been shot, after which he hurried down the spiral and along the rear hall to the garage, where he snatched his hat and coat from the car. He threw the coat over his shoulders like a cloak and went on outside. He made his way across the lawn to the orchard, through the orchard to the lawn of Humphrey Good's house, and across this to Good's side door. He stood there for a few seconds, imagining himself opening the door and going inside. Then he stopped the timing hands and returned to the Fleming house, locking the garage doors behind him. In the garage, he looked at the watch. It had taken exactly 6 minutes and 22 seconds. He knew that he could move more rapidly than the dumpy lawyer, but to balance that, he had been moving over more or less unfamiliar ground. He left his hat and trench coat in the car and went upstairs. Undressing, he went into the bathroom in his dressing gown, spent about 20 minutes shaving and taking a shower, and then returned to his own room. End of Chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Murder in the Gunroom. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Murder in the Gunroom by H. Beam Piper. Chapter 17. When he rose the next morning, Rand noticed something which had escaped his eye when he had gone to bed the night before. His .38 Special, in its shoulder holster, was lying on the dresser. He had not bothered putting it on when he had gone to see Rivers the morning before, and it had lain there all the previous day. He distinctly remembered having moved it shortly after dinner, when he had gone to his room for some notes he had made on the collection. However, between that time and the present, it had managed to flop itself over. The holster was now lying back up. Intrigued by such a remarkable accomplishment in an inanimate object, Rand crossed the room in the dress of nature in which he slept, and looked more closely at it, receiving a second and considerably more severe surprise. The revolver in the holster was not his own. It was, to be sure, a .38 Colt Detective Special, and it was in his holster, but it was not the Detective Special he had brought with him from New Belfast. His own gun was of the second type, with the corners rounded off the grip. This one was of the original issue, with the square police positive grip. His own gun had seen hard service. This one was in practically new condition. There was a discrepancy of about 30,000 in the serial numbers. His gun had been loaded in 6 chambers with the standard 158 grain loads. This one was loaded in only 5 with 148 grain mid-range wad cutter loads. Rand stood for some time looking at the revolver. The worst of it was that he couldn't be exactly sure when the substitution had been made. It might have happened at any time between 8 o'clock and 12, when he had gone to bed. He rather suspected that it had been accomplished while he had been in the bathroom, however. Dumping out the 5 rounds in the cylinder, he inspected the changeling carefully. It was, he thought, the revolver Lane Fleming had kept in the drawer of the gunroom desk. There was no obstruction in the 2-inch barrel. The weapon had not been either fired or cleaned recently. The firing pin had not been shortened. The mainspring showed the proper amount of tension, and the mechanism functioned as it should. There was a chance that somebody had made up 5 special hand loads for him, using nitroglycerin instead of powder, but that didn't seem likely, as it would not necessitate a switch of revolvers. There were 4 or 5 other possibilities, all of them disquieting. He would have been a great deal less alarmed if somebody had taken a shot at him. Getting a box of cartridges out of his Gladstone, he filled the cylinder with 158 grain loads. When he went to the bathroom, he took the revolver in his dressing gown pocket. When he dressed, he put on the shoulder holster and pocketed a handful of spare rounds. Anton Varcek was loitering in the hall when he came out. He gave Rand good morning, and fell into step with him as they went toward the stairway. "Colonel Rand, I wish you wouldn't mention this to anybody, but I would like a private talk with you," the Czech said, "after Fred Dunmore has left for the plant. Would that be possible?" "Yes, Mr. Varcek. I'll be in the gunroom all morning, working." They reached the bottom of the stairway, where Gladys was waiting. "Understand," Rand continued, "I never really studied biology. I was exposed to it in school, but at that time I was preoccupied with the so-called social sciences." Varcek took the conversational shift in stride. "Of course," he agreed, "but you are trained in the scientific method of thought. That, at least, is something. When I have opportunity to explain my ideas more fully, I believe you'll be interested in my conclusions." They greeted Gladys and walked with her to the dining room. As usual, Geraldine was absent. Dunmore and Nelda were already at the table, eating in silence. Both of them seemed self-conscious after the pitched battle of the evening before. Rand broke the tension by offering Humphrey Goode in the role of whipping boy. He had no sooner made a remark in derogation of the lawyer than Nelda and her husband broke into a duet of vituperation. In the end, everybody affected to agree that the whole unpleasant scene had been entirely Goode's fault, and a pleasant spirit of mutual cordiality prevailed. Finally, Dunmore got up, wiping his mouth on a napkin. "Well, it's about time to get to work," he said. "We might as well save gas and both use my car. Coming, Anton?" "I'm sorry, Fred, I can't leave yet. I have some notes upstairs I have to get in order. I was working on this new egg powder last evening, and I want to continue the experiments at the plant laboratory. I think I know how we'll be able to cut production costs on it, about 5%. "And boy, can we stand that!" Dunmore grunted. "Well, I'll be seeing you at the plant." Rand waited until Dunmore had left, then went across to the library and up to the gunroom. As soon as he entered the room above, he saw what was wrong. The previous thefts had been masked by substitutions, but whoever had helped himself to one or more of the recent metallic cartridge specimens the night before hadn't bothered with any such precaution, and a pair of vacant screw hooks disclosed the removal. A second look told Rand what had been taken: the little .25 Webley & Scott from the Pollard collection, with the silencer. The pistol trade which had been imposed on him had disquieted him. Now he had no hesitation in admitting to himself he was badly scared. Whoever had taken that little automatic had had only one thought in mind: noiseless and stealthy murder. Very probably with one Colonel Jefferson Davis Rand in mind as the prospective corpse. He sat down at the desk and started typing, at the same time trying to keep the hall door and the head of the spiral stairway under observation. It was an attempt which was responsible for quite a number of typographical errors. Finally, Anton Varcek came in from the hallway, approached the desk, and sat down in an armchair. "Colonel Rand," he began in a low voice, "I have been thinking over a remark you made last evening. Were you serious when you alluded to the possibility that Lane Fleming had been murdered?" "Well, the idea had occurred to me," Rand understated, keeping his right hand close to his left coat lapel. "I take it you have begun to doubt that it was an accident?" "I would doubt a theory that a skilled chemist would accidentally poison himself in his own laboratory," Varcek replied. "I would not, for instance, pour myself a drink from a bottle labeled HNO3, in the belief that it contained vodka. I believe that Lane Fleming should be credited with equal caution about firearms." "Yet you were the first to advance the theory that the shooting had been an accident," Rand pointed out. "I have a strong dislike for firearms. Varsic looked at the pistols on the desk as though they were so many rattlesnakes. "I've always feared an accident, with so many in the house. When I saw him lying dead, with a revolver in his hand, that was my first thought. First thoughts are so often illogical, emotional." "And you didn't consider the possibility of suicide?" "No, absolutely not." The Czech was emphatic. "The idea never occurred to me, then or since. Lane Fleming was not the man to do that. He was deeply religious, much interested in church work. And aside from that, he had no reason to wish to die. His health was excellent, much better than that of many men 20 years his junior. He had no business worries. The company is doing well, we had large government contracts during the war, and no reconversion problems afterward. We now have more orders than we have plant capacity to fill, and Mr. Fleming was consulting with architects about plant expansion. We have been spared any serious labor troubles, and Mr. Fleming's wife was devoted to him, and he to her. He had no family troubles." Rand raised an eyebrow over the last. "No?" he inquired. Varsic flushed. "Please, Colonel Rand, you must not judge by what you have seen since you came here. When Lane Fleming was alive, such scenes as that in the library last evening would have been unthinkable. Now this family is like a ship without a captain. And since you do not think that he shot himself, either deliberately or inadvertently, there remains the alternative that he was shot by somebody else, either deliberately or, very improbably, by inadvertence," Rand said. "I think the latter can be safely disregarded. Let's agree that it was murder, and go on from there." Varsic nodded. "You are investigating it as such?" he asked. "I am appraising and selling this pistol collection," Rand told him wearily. "I am curious about who killed Fleming, of course. For my own protection, I like to know the background of situations in which I am involved. But do you think Humphrey Goode would bring me here to stir up a lot of sleeping dogs that might awake and grab him by the pants seat? Or did you think that uproar in the library last evening was just a prearranged act?" "I had not thought of Humphrey Goode. It was my understanding that Mrs. Fleming brought you here." "Mrs. Fleming wants her money out of the collection as soon as possible," Rand said. "To reopen the question of her husband's death and start a murder investigation wouldn't exactly expedite things. I'm just a more or less innocent bystander who wants to know whether there's going to be any trouble or not. Now, you came here to tell me what happened on the night of Lane Fleming's death, didn't you?" "Yes." "We had finished dinner at about 7, Varsic said. Lane had been up here for about an hour before dinner, working on his new revolver. He came back here immediately after he was through eating. A little later, when I had finished my coffee, I came upstairs by the main stairway. The door of this room was open, and Lane was inside, sitting on that old shoemaker's bench, working on the revolver. He had it apart, and he was cleaning a part of it. The round part, where the loads go. The drum, is it? Cylinder." "How was he cleaning it?" Rand asked. "He was using a small brush, like a test tube brush. He was scrubbing out the holes, the chambers. He was using a solvent that smelled something like banana oil." Rand nodded. He could visualize the progress Fleming had made. If Varsic was telling the truth, and he remembered what Walters had told him, the last flicker of possibility that Lane Fleming's death had been accidental vanished. "I talked with him for some 10 minutes or so," Varsic continued, "about some technical problems at the plant. All the while, he kept on working on this revolver, and finished cleaning out the cylinder, and also the barrel. He was beginning to put the revolver together when I left him and went up to my laboratory. About 15 minutes later, I heard the shot. For a moment, I debated with myself as to what I had heard, and then I decided to come down here. But first I had to take a solution off a Bunsen burner, where I had been heating it, and take the temperature of it, and then wash my hands because I had been working with poisonous materials. I should say all this took me about 5 minutes. When I got down here, the door of his room was closed and locked. That was most unusual, and I became really worried. I pounded on the door and called out, but I got no answer. Then Fred Dunmore came out of the bathroom attached to his room, with nothing on but a bathrobe. His hair was wet, and he was in his bare feet and making wet tracks on the floor. From there on, Varsik's story tallied closely with what Rand had heard from Gladys and from Walters. Everybody's story tallied where it could be checked up on. "You think the murderer locked the door behind him when he came out of here?" Varzik asked. "I think somebody locked the door, sometime. It might have been the murderer, or it might have been Fleming at the murderer's suggestion. But why couldn't the murderer have left the gunroom by that stairway?" Varzik looked around furtively and lowered his voice. Now he looked like Rudolf Hess discussing what to do about Ernst Röhm. "Colonel Rand, don't you think that Fred Dunmore could have shot Lane Fleming, and then have gone to his room and waited until I came downstairs?" he asked. Here we go again, Rand thought. Just like the Rivers case, everybody putting the finger on everybody else. "And have undressed and taken a bath while he was waiting?" he inquired. "You came down here only 5 minutes after the shot. In that time, Dunmore would have had to wipe his fingerprints off the revolver, leave it in Fleming's hand, put that oily rag in his other hand, set the dead latch, cross the hall, undress, get into the bathtub, and start bathing. That's pretty fast work." "But who else could have done it?" "Well, you, for one. You could have come down from your lab, shot Fleming, faked the suicide, and then gone out, locking the door behind you, and made a demonstration in the hall until you were joined by Dunmore and the ladies. Then, with your innocence well established, you could have waited until your wife prompted you, as she or somebody else was sure to, and then have gone down to the library and up the spiral," Rand said. "That's about as convincing, no more and no less, as your theory about Dunmore." Varzik agreed sadly. "And I cannot prove otherwise, can I?" "You can advance your Dunmore theory to establish reasonable doubt," Rand told him. "And if Dunmore's accused, he can do the same with the theory I've just outlined. And as long as reasonable doubt exists, neither of you could be convicted. This isn't the Third Reich or the Soviet Union. They wouldn't execute both of you to make sure of getting the right one. Both of you had a motive in this Millpack merger that couldn't have been negotiated while Fleming lived. One or the other of you may be guilty. On the other hand, both of you may be innocent." "Then who?" Varzik had evidently bet his roll on Dunmore. "There is no one else who could have done it." "The garage doors were open, if I recall," Rand pointed out. "Anybody could have slipped in that way, come through the rear hall to the library and up the spiral, and have gone out the same way. Some of the French maquis I worked with during the Cold War could have wiped out the whole family, one after the other, that way." A look of intense concentration settled upon Varsik's face. He nodded several times. "Yes, of course," he said, his thought chain complete. "And you spoke of motive. From what you must have heard last evening, Humphrey Goode was no less interested in the merger than Fred Dunmore or myself. And then there's your friend Gresham. He's quite familiar with the interior of this house, and who knows what terms National Milling and Packaging may have made with him, contingent upon his success in negotiating the merger." "I'm not forgetting either of them," Rand said. "Or Fred Dunmore, or you. If you did it, I'd advise you to confess now. It'll save everybody, yourself included, a lot of trouble." Varzik looked at him, fascinated. "Why, I believe you regard all of us just as I do my fruit flies," he said at length. "You know, Colonel Rand, you are not a comfortable sort of man to have around." He rose slowly. "Naturally, I'll not mention this interview. I suppose you won't want to, either?" "I'd advise you not to talk about it, at that," Rand said. "The situation here seems to be very delicate and rather explosive. Oh, as you go out, I'd be obliged to you for sending Walters up here. I still have this work here, and I'll need his help." After Varzik had left him, Rand looked in the desk drawer, verifying his assumption that the .38 he had seen there was gone. He wondered where his own was at the moment. When the butler arrived, he was put to work bringing pistols to the desk, carrying them back to the racks, taking measurements, and the like. All the while, Rand kept his eye on the head of the spiral stairway. Finally, he caught a movement and saw what looked like the top of a peak-crowned gray felt hat between the spindles of the railing. He eased the Detective Special out of its holster and got to its feet. "All right," he sang out. "Come on up." Walters looked, obviously startled, at the revolver that had materialized in Rand's hand, and at the two men who were emerging from the spiral. He was even more startled, it seemed, when he realized that they wore the uniform of the state police. "What's the meaning of this, sir?" he demanded of Rand. "You're being arrested," Rand told him. "Just stand still now." He stepped around the desk and frisked the butler quickly, wondering if he were going to find a .25 Webley & Scott automatic or his own .38 Special. When he found neither, he holstered his temporary weapon. "If this is your idea of a joke, sir, permit me to say that it isn't. It's no joke, son," Sergeant McKenna told him. "In this country, a police officer doesn't have to recite any incantation before he makes an arrest, any more than he needs to read any riot act before he can start shooting. But it won't hurt you to warn you that anything you say can be used against you." "At least I must insist upon knowing why I'm being arrested," Walters said icily. "Oh, don't you know?" McKenna asked. "Why, you're being arrested for the murder of Arnold Rivers." For a moment, the butler retained his professional glacial disdain, and then the bottom seemed to drop suddenly out of him. Rand suppressed a smile at this minor verification of his theory. Walters had been expecting to be accused of larceny, and was prepared to treat the charge with contempt. Then he had realized, after a second or so, what the state police sergeant had really said. "Good God, gentlemen!" He looked from Mick McKenna to Corporal Cavaline to Rand, and back again in bewilderment. "You surely can't mean that!" "We can, and we do," Rand told him. "You stole about 25 pistols from this collection after Mr. Fleming died, and sold them to Arnold Rivers. Then, when I came here and started checking up on the collection, you knew the game was up. So, last evening, you took out the station wagon and went to see Rivers, and you killed him to keep him from turning state's evidence and incriminating you. Or maybe you killed him in a quarrel over the division of the loot. I hope for your sake that it was the latter. If it was, you may get off with second-degree murder. But if you can't prove that there was no premeditation, you're tagged for the electric chair." But I didn't kill Mr. Rivers," Walter stammered. "I barely knew the gentleman. I saw him once or twice when he was here to see Mr. Fleming, but outside of that..." "Outside of that, you sold him about 25 of these pistols, and got a like number of junk pistols from him for replacements." He took the list Pierre Jarret and Stephen Gresham had compiled out of his pocket and began reading. "Italian wheel-lock pistol, late 16th or early 17th century. Pair Italian snap-ounce pistols by Lazzarino Caminazzo." He finished the list and put it away. "I think we've missed one or two, but that'll do for the time." "But I didn't sell those pistols to Mr. Rivers," Walter expostulated. "I sold them to Mr. Carl Gwinnett. I can prove it." That Rand had not expected. "Go on," he jeered. "I suppose you have receipts for all of them. Fences always do that, of course." "But I did sell them to Mr. Gwinnett. I can take you to his house if you get a search warrant, and show you where he has them hidden in the garret. He was afraid to offer them for sale until after this collection had been broken up and sold. He still has every one of them." McKenna spat out an obscenity. "Aren't we ever going to have any luck?" he demanded. "Jarret out on a writ this morning, and now this." "But he ain't in the clear," Cavaline argued. "Maybe he didn't sell Rivers the pistols, but maybe he did kill him." "Dope!" McKenna abused his subordinate. "If he didn't sell Rivers the pistols, why would he kill him?" "He's only said he sold them to Gwinnett," Rand pointed out. Then he turned to Walters. "Look here, if we find those pistols in Gwinnett's possession, you're clear on this murder charge. There's still a slight matter of larceny, but that doesn't involve the electric chair. You take my advice and make a confession now, and then accompany these officers to Gwinnett's place and show them the pistols. If you do that, you may expect clemency on the theft charge, too." "Oh, I will, sir. I'll sign a full confession, and take those police officers and show them every one of the pistols." Rand put paper and carbon sheets in the typewriter. As Walters dictated, he typed. The butler listed every pistol which Gresham and Pierre Jarret had found missing, and a cased presentation pair of .44 Colt 1860s that nobody had missed. He signed the triplicate copies willingly. He didn't seem to mind signing himself into jail, as long as he thought he was signing himself out of the electric chair. The book in which Fleming had recorded his pistols he still had. He had removed it from the gunroom and was keeping it in his room. He said he would get it, along with the things he would need to take to jail with him. When it was finished, they all went down the spiral stairway into the library. Nelda was standing at the foot of it. Evidently, she had been listening to what had been going on upstairs. "You dirty sneak!" she yelled, catching sight of Walters. "After all we've done for you, you turn around and rob us. I hope they give you 20 years. Walters turned to McKenna. "Sergeant, I am willing to accept the penalty of the law for what I have done, but I don't believe, sir, that it includes being yapped at by this vulgar bitch." Nelda let out an inarticulate howl of fury and sprang at him, nails raking. Corporal Cavaline caught her wrist before she could claw the prisoner. "That's enough, you," he told her. "You stop that, or you'll spend a night in jail yourself." She jerked her arm loose from his grasp and flung out of the library. As she went out, Gladys entered. Rand, who had been bringing up in the rear, stepped down from the stairway. "He confessed," he said softly. "We had to bluff it out of him, but he came across. Sold the pistols to Carl Gwinnett. We're going now to pick up Gwinnett and the pistols." "I'm glad you found the pistols," she told him. "But what are we going to do over the weekend for a butler?" Rand snapped his fingers. "Damn it, I never thought of that!" He allowed his brow to furrow with thought. "I won't promise anything, but I may be able to dig up somebody for you, for a day or so. Some of my friends are visiting their son in the Naval Hospital on the West Coast, and their butler may be glad for a chance to pick up a little extra money. Shall I call him and find out?" "Oh, Colonel Rand, would you? I'd be eternally grateful." It was just as easy as that. End of chapter 17.